A very warm welcome everyone to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name is Barry Sadler, and today I want to share with you some experiences that I've had recently regarding unmanned surface vessels. First of all, I would like to paint a picture of something that happened to me a few nights ago whilst I was piloting a relatively large container vessel out of the port of Southampton. And we'll take our autonomous podcast from there. The ship that I was piloting was a medium-sized container vessel, nothing huge, 290 metres long, approximately 90,000 gross tonnes. At the time she had a draft of approximately 11 metres. A nice handy vessel, fairly fast off the mark, and she behaved exceptionally well on her way out to sea. It was a late night departure, departing at 11 o'clock at night, and by midnight we were in the central Solent. I had just completed the second of our West Bramble turns. Southampton has an S-shaped channel right in the central Solent. 2 turns outward bound, a 90-degree turn to starboard known as the cowshot turn, and a 140-degree turn to port known as the West Bramble turn. Fairly notorious turns within the port of Southampton. A lot of masters on ships when we are sailing on them comment on these turns. These turns are often used in simulators to educate masters in the perils of pilotage. And so when a captain sees the West Bramble turn for the first time in real life, it can be a really unnerving experience for them. As pilots, we navigate the West Bramble turn hundreds of times a year. And so we really do have a lot of experience in being able to get these big ships around these turns. But it's not the turn that was the issue on this particular evening. I was outward bound, and I had just finished the 140-degree turn to port at the West Brambles and was steadying up on my outward course to take the ship out to the Eastern Solent, out through the deep water channel past the Nab Tower where I would disembark. Basically, the course outward bound down the Thorn Channel is approximately 220 degrees, and we're altering course all the way round to port to around 100, perhaps 105 degrees, 105. So a alteration of course to port of between 120 and 140 degrees depending upon the state of the tide. I steadied up on approximately 110. It was a flood tide, and with the leeway that was being created by the wind and the drift created by the tide, 110 took me out the Eastern Solent quite nicely. When I'd steadied up, I noticed that there were 2 white lights moving around the bank on my port side. The bank on my port side is the Ryde Middle Bank, 2.5 mile long bank, smack bang in the middle of the Solent. You can navigate to the south or to the north of the bank. It's deeper to the south, so we tend to take container vessels that are fairly deep draft south of the Ryde Middle Bank. The 2 white lights that I had spotted were erratically moving around the Ryde Middle Bank. I put up the binoculars and they looked to me to be kids playing around in boats. The boats were not following any particular passage plan. They were weaving around, basically jostling with each other around the Ryde Middle Bank. I watched these lights and looked at the radar. On the radar there were some AIS targets which seemed to come in with the white lights that I was spotting. So I watched these AIS targets on the radar and plotted them with both the radar and interrogated the AIS. The targets were small, very, very small, and the radar kept losing the targets, but the AIS targets fundamentally remained very, very strong. So I kept the targets plotted and monitored them. At around the same time that I'd plotted the AIS targets, I heard VTS calling up another vessel and asking that vessel where it was. They got no response from the vessel when they asked where it was, and I didn't quite understand why they would question the ship and ask where the ship was. Normally VTS are monitoring vessels that are progressing through the Solent and would generally know their location and would be interrogating them about their intentions, not necessarily interrogating them about their position. It later transpired that the vessel that was being interrogated by VTS was indeed a mothership for an autonomous vessel trial. The mothership had AIS as well, but was nowhere to be seen in the central Solent. In other words, these two white lights were on their own with no mothership near them. VTS then called me and advised me that the two targets on my port side were USVs, unmanned surface vessels, that should have been under the control of a mothership, but the mothership could not be found and its whereabouts were currently unknown. The mothership had in fact left the two unmanned surface vessels on their own and proceeded to pick up a third unmanned surface vessel to bring that vessel out to join the other two for some unmanned surface vessel trials in the central Solent. These trials were well publicised, and indeed VTS knew about them, but at no point did VTS expect the mothership to leave these unmanned surface vehicles on their own. The unmanned surface vehicles were remote vehicles. They weren't full autonomous vehicles. In other words, they were being controlled remotely by a person on board the mothership. Now, because the mothership was nowhere to be seen, these vessels, although being controlled remotely, were effectively on their own, with nobody monitoring what they were doing with regards to other vessels. Because I'd plotted them on the radar, actually plotted their AIS targets because the radar targets wouldn't hold because they were very small, I could see their tracks, I could see their true vectors, and the radar alarm subsequently sounded, indicating that one of these USVs was approaching me so as to involve risk of collision. It was a single white light on a vessel, so therefore, as it was a power-driven vessel, less than 7 meters, less than 7 knots, and indeed I subsequently found out that these autonomous vessels were indeed 6 meters long. The first of these autonomous vessels approached me and risk of collision existed. So I watched this vessel, and all of a sudden it occurred to me that I was engaged in a coal wreck situation with an unmanned ship. I had a power-driven vessel that was crossing my bow from port to starboard. I was on that vessel's starboard side, so according to Rule 15, and let's not forget that unmanned surface vessels still need to comply with the coal regs because they are indeed a vessel, they were the giveaway vessel under Rule 15. I was another power-driven vessel crossing on their starboard side, therefore they have an obligation to keep out of my way. I carefully monitored this particular vessel as it approached me. It did nothing. It kept coming and coming, and then I began to think, the coal regs now require me to sound 5 or more short and rapid blasts of the whistle, because I am immediately in doubt as to the intentions of this vessel. Rule 34D requires me to immediately indicate such doubt by using that signal. But who am I sounding the signal at? Was the mothership close enough for them to be able to hear that signal and react? Because at the end of the day, responsibility for that unmanned surface vessel remained with the control station, and the control station was on the mothership. Would they be able to hear my 5 or more short and rapid blasts? Legally, does it have the same meaning if heard by the mothership that the USV was indeed creating a bit of a nuisance of itself? I altered course to starboard to try and open the CPA with the unmanned surface vessel, having had absolutely no response from the mothership after VTS called them, and I gave it a wide berth. What subsequently happened was that VTS managed to get hold of the mothership. They gave the mothership a bit of a telling off for leaving 2 unmanned surface vessels in the vicinity of the Ride Middle. Once VTS had pointed out that I was outward bound, both these unmanned surface vehicles immediately stopped where they were. Their vectors went to 0, and I suspect that the operator on the mothership had literally just told both vessels to stop. I thought about this afterwards, and I thought that is probably the first time ever in my 40-year career at sea that I have approached another vessel so as to involve risk of collision, and that other vessel did not have any human presence on board. It wasn't a fully autonomous ship. It didn't execute decisions independently, but it was, under the IMO definitions, a level 3 autonomous vessel. Level 3 autonomous vessels are remotely controlled with no crew on board. The IMO were basically forced to create these levels of autonomy back in 2017. Level 1 is a ship with automated decision support but with crew on board. Level 2 is a remotely controlled vessel but again with crew on board. Level 3 is remote control with no crew on board. And Level 4 is a fully autonomous ship that makes and executes decisions independent of any human intervention. So the vessel I was approaching was a Level 3 remote controlled USV with no crew on board. But even still, it was very, very unnerving. It's quite a thing when you are a lecturer and you understand collision regulations as well as you do. You understand responsibilities as well as you do, to be approaching a vessel like this with risk of collision, because your mind starts to think of the implications of having a close quarter situation, or even the implications of a collision with this vessel. I had to fully comply with the coal regs, and therefore, having decided that the other vessel was not taking action, under Rule 17, I may take action by my manoeuvre alone, and I came to starboard and gave them extra room. My alteration of course to starboard subsequently wasn't necessary. As I say, once VTS got hold of the mothership, both the unmanned surface vessels on my port bow immediately stopped, and risk of collision no longer existed. But for perhaps 5 or 6 minutes, I was approaching these craft with no idea as to whether or not they would comply with the collision regulations. The coal regs take this into account. A manned ship sometimes doesn't comply with the coal regs, and the coal regs allow the stand-on vessel to take action by their manoeuvre alone. So I took that action, and therefore at no point would there have been a collision. I would have avoided that unmanned surface vessel. But it raises some interesting thoughts, and to me personally it was a milestone in how I deal with vessels around me. Approaching a vessel that is remote controlled with no human on board is a very, very strange sensation. You don't know what the ship's going to do. You don't know whether it's going to slow down, speed up, whether it's going to comply with the coal regs, whether it's not going to comply with the coal regs. The absence of any mothership or any independent control around this unmanned surface craft just made the whole situation a lot more surreal. Unmanned vessels have been around for quite some time. At the end of the day, the first unmanned vessels go way, way back to the 1960s and 1980s when naval forces, particularly US and UK naval forces, pioneered remotely operated mine countermeasure vessels. This was taken on further in the 80s by the oil and gas industry that adopted ROVs, remote operated vehicles, for subsea inspections and maintenance. And these laid the foundation, if you like, for uncrewed control in all marine conditions, indeed the harshest marine conditions. Although those early vessels were remotely piloted, they were not autonomous. Human operators, of course, remain responsible for all the decisions that were made. Surface autonomy developed over the next few decades, mainly driven by defence agencies, but once we got to 2017, the first autonomous shipping company was formed, Yara Birkeland, which was a zero-emission container ship which operated fully autonomously in Norway. Within the UK in 2018, a UK company, Seakit, launched a 12-metre USV Max Lima, which completed an unmanned North Sea mission controlled remotely from the UK. So by the time we'd got to the 2020s, we were having some major technological breakthroughs in unmanned surface vessels. In recent years, this has increased massively in its momentum. In 2020, Ocean Infinity launched its Armada fleet, which is a set of robotic vessels that were between 6 metres and 78 metres long, and the smaller vessels were controlled remotely from onshore command centres and command centres on their larger Armada surface vessels. I was very lucky a few years ago to be able to visit the control centre at Ocean Infinity in Southampton and see how these unmanned surface vessels would be remotely controlled from the control centre. A tiered set of pod stations were there, with 24 basic control pod stations capable of obviously controlling 24 vessels, 7 command pod stations above that. So if you like, the 24 pod stations were the officer of the watch, with 7 captain command pod centres above that, ready to take over if the regular operation wasn't going according to plan. There were 2 crisis centres within the same control room. These were soundproof boxes that would be used in case there was an emergency on an unmanned vessel, including a loss of control. So the infrastructure was very, very much there for unmanned surface vessels to be remotely controlled from Southampton. It's an amazing centre that Ocean Infinity have, and I really do thank them for introducing me to the command centre and the concept of remote control of these vessels. But until such as happened the other night, I actually approached one of these unmanned surface craft and it affected my navigation. I didn't have the proper understanding of the gargantuan leap forward in technology that we are currently seeing and the new worries and concerns that it would bring in, especially when a manned vessel meets an unmanned vessel. Unmanned vessels, particularly the small ones, are a fantastic idea. Particularly search and rescue and surveying applications. The ability to put a dozen small unmanned surface vessels in the water, remotely control them from a central point and allow them to survey the seabed or search for other vessels is a very, very efficient and effective way of surveying and searching huge areas of ocean and ocean seabed. The IMO is very, very close to completing its mass code, which hopefully will have some non-mandatory guidelines by the end of this year and binding instruments likely to have come by the end of 2032. Now, in the UK, the MCA have started to develop some form of regulation when it comes to autonomy. At the end of the day, maritime autonomous surface ships, as they're called, MASS, M-A-S-S, is the buzzword currently going round. And these levels of autonomy defined by the IMO are being incorporated into United Kingdom, first of all, guidance, and eventually into United Kingdom legislation. The closest we get to control here in the UK is, of course, the Workboat Code, edition number 3. And give it a Google and give it a read. It's quite an amazing thing that this latest edition of the Workboat Code sets out the requirements for unmanned vessels, albeit under 24 metres within that code. That code's an MCA document, and therefore you can pretty much use it as the regulations that currently apply to unmanned vessels under 24 metres. The MCA have put a general exemption out for unmanned mini vessels less than 2.5 metres, which subsequently says that there's no MCA certification needed, provided that certain conditions have been met. In other words, if your unmanned surface vessel is less than 2.5 metres, the MCA will allow you to operate it with little or no MCA oversight. If you have a vessel greater than 24 metres, then the MCA deal with it on a case-by-case basis. You would approach the MCA with a proposal for a larger unmanned ship, and the MCA would risk assess it, and the more complex, larger vessels would require many more exemptions from the MCA in order to bypass IMO regulations and meet some of them. But at the end of the day, regardless of what that says, even a fully autonomous unmanned surface vessel is still required to comply with the collision regulations, which why when you're approaching one that's not is such a worry. The Workboat Code Edition 3 within Annex 2 is got some very, very interesting interpretations and interesting statements that it makes. Within the Workboat Code itself, remote unmanned vessels can't be fitted with cranes. They must have an engine. Must not have an engine, which can only be hand started. Yet they can't have open flame appliance or gas installations or liquid fuel cookers. There's lots of things that an unmanned vessel cannot do in compliance with the Workboat Code. Lucky for me as a pilot at the moment, I feel an unmanned vessel cannot be a pilot boat. It specifically says that within the code. It can't engage in towing. So there's a lot of things that it can't do. Some interesting things about unmanned surface vessels where some regulations do apply. A good example is official logbooks. If you've got a remotely operated unmanned vessel of over 25 gross tonnes, the same law applies to that vessel as applies to any other vessel over 25 tonnes. It requires an official logbook. Now, the official logbook will be completed and kept at the control position, and the entries in that official logbook would be the same as the entries that you would have in any official logbook. It's a bit strange really when you think about it, because things like drills would not be required on board a remote unmanned vessel. There's nobody to drill. Pretty sure that the MCA would take a dim view if there were no drills held either ashore at the control position or on another vessel with remote control capabilities. Drills such as loss of control or breakdown of the unmanned vessel itself. But it is interesting to note that the information recorded within the working log that this unmanned vessel control position is required to keep include things like pre-departure checks, compass courses, weather. So you've got to be able to remotely measure the weather wherever your unmanned surface vessel is. You must note the speed. You must note any overboard discharges, the weight of any cargo carried, which, by the way, cannot be dangerous goods. Dangerous goods cannot be carried on unmanned vessels. There are lots of other entries that are required by it, including a record of any near misses, including supporting information to prove that any departure from the coal rigs was necessary to avoid immediate danger shall also be recorded. All near misses shall be reported. I wonder if the remote operator of that USV on that dark night when I was outward bound on my container ship kept his log. Has he reported a near miss with a container ship? Wouldn't bother me if he didn't, because it wasn't particularly a near miss. The USV at the end of the day passed a good 4 cables down my port side. It's interesting, isn't it? The first time in my career that I've approached an unmanned vessel so as to involve risk of collision. And in my opinion, it was even more concerning than approaching a manned vessel that had somebody under the helm who perhaps did not have little or no experience in dealing with the collision regulations. At least sounding 5 or more short and rapid blasts at that vessel, no matter how inexperienced the person behind the helm was, they would hear that signal and hopefully it would prompt them into realizing that they are doing something wrong. There's nobody on an unmanned vessel to hear my doubt signal. And at the end of the day, had that unmanned vessel had kept going, it would have passed very, very close down my port side. Nonetheless, it was a lesson for me, and I hope sharing the experience a lesson for everybody, that we are going to start to see these unmanned vessels a lot more frequently around the world in test areas like the Central Solent, and we need to be ready to deal with them. We need to be ready to take action in collision situations if they don't, and ready at the end of the day to take into account that some of our comfort blanket that we have with a vessel that is not giving way to us but is manned isn't there anymore. Communicating with an unmanned vessel is impossible for most manned ships, and therefore we need to take that into account when navigating in their vicinity. I hope you found this insight interesting, guys, and I look forward to welcoming you to the next edition of the Maritime Education Podcast. In the meantime, guys, do have a great day, and I'll speak to you again soon.